By way of introduction, I might just want to say actually that I spent the first few years of my career trained to be a designer, studying at the Royal College of Art, working in the early tech industry. And I found myself there a bit odd because I was actually an activist. And then I spent 15 years working as a tech activist, working with human rights defenders and civil rights groups. And I found myself a bit odd there as well, because actually I'm a designer. And so now I brought my work together of activism and design. So I consider myself now to be an activist tech designer, which makes me really odd because there are very few of us. So thank you for bringing me to meet other professional troublemakers here today. And also to Bernard, who encouraged me to bring the question of ethics in the new built environment to this discussion. So thinking about the way in which technology changes our environment. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So you'll be glad to know I'm not going to talk about the ethics of Barbie or the ethics of encouraging our girls to grow up with this representation of the female form. But rather here, this example is something quite different, which is what happens when we bring technology to objects, and what sort of tricky things happen, what complexity happens when we do that. And you might know this is a first artificial intelligence Barbie that was released a few years ago. And the idea was, of course, that Barbie could talk to the person who would play with the child who would be playing with it. And these are the kind of conversations you could have with Barbie. This is something from the testing of when they first launched it in 2015. Mainly the bottom line, which is Barbie saying back to the child, Ariana, who's trying it here, fantastic, I just know we're going to be great friends. And one of the things which we find interesting is like, what happens when we lift the curtain, this great friendship? What does that really look like? Well, it's pretty complex. You've got on the left side, parental control. Basically, it's kind of like an interesting surveillance toy. It essentially records everything the child says in order to learn from it, and then plays it back to the adults who can listen to it. And then on the right-hand side here, you've got an example of what happens with the child's interaction. And despite the fact that Mattel, along with the company who made it, tried to record 5,000 pieces of voice of Barbie speaking to the child, Barbie couldn't deal with, and machine learning couldn't deal with, the kinds of questions children would ask. And the story would go something like, Barbie would ask about the girl's sister, the girl would say, I hate my sister, Barbie would say, why? And then they would get into a discussion that was really complicated because Barbie wasn't built to deal with that kind of complexity. And of course it was brought, like all good tech products, to market in half the time that it normally takes, so it was basically tested in the wild as well. So we got one in our studio and tried it out, which had a lot of fun with my colleagues, trying things out, listening to each other and so on. And then after some time it got a bit boring, collected dust on the shelf. And then just last week actually I got this email saying, we're really sorry, you can see the bits highlighted in grey. On July 15, 2019, the technology and the pull-string power products, such as Hello Barbie, will no longer work. And so what happens when you have a product like that, when you start, so I find out my friend Barbie is not going to exist anymore, my conversation with her is not going to exist anymore, but what kind of conversation do parents have to have with their children when they say, as of July 15th, 2019, Barbie won't talk to you anymore? And how does that work? So yeah, I'd say there's huge complexities in designing digital things in ways that we've really not begun to think about. I have to say that the technology design industry, in my view, is so immature, it is so underdeveloped, it is so disconnected from the rest of the design dialogue. And you'll probably see me come up with phrases here that would be familiar to you in other fields of design, but not in technology design. And what we see is that, we are building the lived environment with these tools, and you would never find students coming out of architecture school not having the skills to know how to interact with the real world. And we do see that with technology designers, which I think is a really big deficit. So we have to be much better at doing it. We have to get better at thinking about ethics in designing technology that really changes the way people behave and their relationships and the environment they're living in. So for example, like what happens when you enter the slipstream between a child's relationship with her new best friend. You have to think about that in a more full way. So yeah, I would say they're particularly tricky because they really do amplify the social and political moment that they come from. And this is where we are now. Technologies which are made in China, sometimes like in the Barbie case, designed in California and criticized in Europe, and that's how we see ourselves at Tactical Tech. This is one of our projects. We, as I said, we're professional troublemakers. One of the things we like to do is use the language of these technology companies to also engage with people, to ask them about these questions. We've done a series of exhibitions called the Glass Room. This is one of them in London. We took over high street locations and we set up stores that look like an Apple store. You go in, but there's nothing for sale. And everything in there is a kind of critique of technology. And the people working in there, you'll probably see a little bit here, we call them ingeniuses, which is like a play on the Apple Store. And they're not selling you anything, they're giving you advice about your use of technology, data privacy, and so on. And what we found is that people really want to have this conversation. When we brought this to London, people said to us, nobody in England cares about data privacy, about surveillance, and all these things. But rather, in just 3 weeks, we had 20,000 people through the door, and we had a line all down Leicester Square. We've done these in New York and London, and we've had about 100,000 people come to our exhibitions, and we're about to do it in San Francisco, which will be an interesting challenge, I think, bringing it to the home of technology. So ethics haven't, in our view, played a strong enough role yet in technology design, but they have to. And I'm just going to say very quickly something about the business case, and I'm going to do this because in the tech industry, it's such a massive motivator. You cannot have a discussion with a single tech designer or product designer or executive without dealing with the money question. And that's because it's such an enormously lucrative industry. So I'm just going to make a very quick shortcut because it doesn't require a lot of time to say why the business case for looking at ethics in design technology. And that's the main reason why everything's changed. If you've read the newspapers, if you look at the books of any bookshop, even airport bookshop, you'll see that there are books and books and books about the way in which technology is changing the way we live, and not in a good way. And so in my view, everything's changed. And I think there's just 3 quick examples about why, if you don't yet believe me, and that technology needs to rethink its ethics. These are 3 quick ones. So 2018, Zuckerberg testifying in Congress. I don't need to explain why, I think, but it is interesting. If you look at the amount of views that this testifying had on YouTube, every single instance of it, millions of people watched it. That's a really strange thing to happen. If you think about it in other sectors, I don't think it would have happened. The second thing is that users are changing their mind as well. Users, and all of us, or many of us holding phones, computers, laptops now, all of us are users. And if you look at this 2019 review from The Economist, just the last line there, is only 7.5% of people haven't changed the way they use the internet after all these scandals have happened. So users want something different as well, and citizens. And then thirdly, I'd just say quickly that the systems themselves are broken. This is an example of Uber and Lyft drivers going around Washington Airport just a few months ago, where they coordinated 150 of them at the same time switching off their systems, causing surge pricing, which caused the prices to go up, which meant that they could take a fare that they actually think is realistic for what they need to be paid. So taking the system into their own hands. And of course, there are lots of others, like walkouts of workers now at Google because of their contracts with the Pentagon and so on. So it's starting to change significantly. And so that's my thinking about the business case for it. But what we've got, there's these, very specific reasons why it's going to change. But what we've got is an industry that has no idea how to deal with these questions. We have design schools that don't equip students with this kind of way of thinking. And by the way, teaching a course at Potsdam right now, design school called Efficiency and Madness, which is trying to do that. But there are very, very few courses trying to do it. But also lots of designers in industry who don't know how to look at this question and are really questioning their own agency as designers and their role in the product development cycle, which was mentioned earlier. So we need new methods for technology design. And I would argue that a lot of them are probably quite straightforward, and we can probably get from other design disciplines as well. So here's just some starting points, just 3. I have 10. I'm not going to do 10, don't worry. I'm just going to do 3, and just to get the conversation going. So most of these are obvious, but they're not yet practiced in technology design. So, basic principle, just because we can doesn't mean we should. And we really don't see this with technology. We see people making technologies all the time where it's dreamt up by a marketing person and a techie thinking, wouldn't that be great? But it's a really bad idea. So, things like this. This is an app called YOLO, which is actually part of Snapchat now, and it's like the #1 plugin for teenagers, which basically allows you to rate your friends anonymously or say anonymous things about them. What could possibly go wrong? And it's not just one that's YOLO on the left is Saraha, which was one before it. And when you go through the list, there's been several apps like this, tried one after the other. People don't give up with this. What goes wrong, of course, is first of all, people hack it. They say to other people, this is how you find out who really wrote that thing that you hate. The second thing, of course, that happens is that people do awful things with it. And then you get parents and authorities and so on having to step in and say, this is really awful, my child's got depression, there's been suicide attempts, in fact, many suicides linked actually to these kinds of tools, and finally taken off App Stores. So yeah, we need a more active and critical design industry on technology, not one that's kind of blindly running forward with enthusiasm. And to think really about, just because we can make these things, should we? And this is Mike Montero, who's a technology designer, saying, basically there is no good design of a Muslim database. This is in the context of the US when Trump was trying to do that. And critique can be fun, not only righteous. And so this is one of our projects called Fake or Real. We get people to play around. Is this a fake thing or a real thing? How silly can it be? One, for example, smart underwear, real or not? Another, self-driving baby stroller, not sure. And you can play this game endlessly, it turns out, because what was amazing when we were trying to come up with these is that most of them exist. So we got this crazy idea, I know, why don't we think of this? And then we go to some patent library and there would be already something there, surprisingly. Okay, number 2, design for the real world, not the ideal world. Of course, borrowing from Biggs Papanak, it's not a new thought, but we don't see that in the technology sector. We certainly don't see it enough. Here's Sheryl Sandberg. Sorry, I'm picking on Facebook just because, it's easy. But I think that here's her talking about what happened in Christchurch with live stream. And when I met people from Facebook, what they said was, we thought it would be great to develop a technology where if you were missing out on your friend's birthday party, you could live stream yourself into the party. What we didn't expect was when we made that technology that people would use it to live stream rape, violence, and massacre. This is a pretty strong statement. And I think what happens in those cases is that companies are putting technologies out there into the wild that interact with a very complex environment in a way that they really haven't taken consideration for. And now they're basically they're doing what I would consider to be an apology tour. But they're not thinking about the consequences of the things that they make, and they're getting away with it as well. One of the things I might want to say is what we're doing as well right now is we're actually working with some technology designers who are open-minded enough to think about this. And what we're really interested in is scale. How can we, as designers and activists and technologists, come in at the base level and do things like change the way the phone system works for 3 billion people? These small tweaks, sometimes very, very small changes, or stopping certain technologies from coming into play could actually have quite a big impact. And many of these, I should just say, I'm not going to show this example in detail, but just to say how important context is. That slide at the beginning about made in China, designed in California, criticized in Europe is kind of a joke, but it's serious. And this is one of the projects that we've also recently done called Personal Data Political Persuasion, looking at how the influence industry works around the world. And what it looks at is the implications of using personal data in elections around the world, basically designed in California very often, not only, thinking about putting into political systems in countries they've never been to before. And what does that mean? So I've got a copy here, if anybody wants one. And the last thing is about bridging the gap between product and policy, and thinking about, in the space that I work in at least, how to think about design that embraces that tricky nature of things and looks at how we say it's not just a regulator's problem, it's not just a lawyer's problem, this is actually something that we can deal with. In its simplest form, I think there are some really basic things that could be done, and I see a lot of people in the industry saying we can't do anything, it's too complicated, it's not up to us, it's up to the my director or my manager or so on. But there are really simple things you can do. When we know that children can't get off their technology, when we know they have habitual design attention problems, depression, stress, and so on, because of the amount of use of technology, we could just not have an autoplay button. It's that simple. So we could just change the way the technology works at a very simple design level, which would actually stop a lot of regulation and policy taking place and change things for many people. So it could be much quicker and if they're more effective. If you think about GDPR coming into play, that took 7 years or something to develop. You could also just change it overnight. We need to recognise, I think Mahmoud used this phrase as well, but not only problem solving design, but also design is problem making in this context of technology. For example, this is Nir Eyal's model of how to hook people into technology, all the persuasive design that's designed to kind of keep you addicted and habituated. And we could like blame children for the use of technology. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of work with youth and tech right now. But we could also just like not blame them for the use of technology and recognise, of course, they can't resist a technology that's been designed specifically to trick them and habituate and addict them to the services that have been given to them. And lastly, we as users can do things. We can vote with our feet. This is a project we have called Data Detox, which is about encouraging people to think about the way in which they use technology and take that into their own hands. So that's the phrase we use, your tech, your way, in that context. Trying to get users to stop, just like with other industries, we can talk about maybe in the panel, what's the parallel with things like fashion? What can't you do about these things as a user, as a consumer? And we think there's a lot that you can do about that. Okay, so that's it. That's a final slide. So just to say, I think we need like really fundamental changes, and I know that the topic was like, how do we talk about ethics in design practice? But to be honest, in technology, there isn't any at the moment. It's very, very little. And so we're really at the bottom of the process, we're at the beginning of the process. And so what I've tried to do really is just throw out some ideas about how we need to get started, why we need to get started in that sector, and what kind of new methods we use. And that's our work just at the very end, thinking about not only individual-based design, but thinking about society as a user of technology, not just about individuals as users of technology. Thank you.